Hello. We will look at Impressionism now. Impressionism art movement that emerged in France particularly, and that spreads from France. It spread to different other places, but it was located in France, and it emerged in the later half of the 19th century. And later half of 19th century, by then you have it was the heights of industrial revolution, right? So France was industrially equipped, developed, and it was during the mid 19th century or after later half of 19th century, and particularly after the second French Revolution, 1848. After that, you have a movement called realism. Realism dealt with, or realism represented whatever they had seen and not what is imagined or what they have not seen, that which is historical or religious. So when you look at Romanticism, they worked with the imagination and the dream scenes. Neoclassicism worked with the history. Neoclassicism worked with mythology, legends, history, and sometimes the biblical themes. When it comes to realism, realism dealt with the contemporary reality, but with a particular ideology of socialism, where they were more concentrated, they were more interested in the working class, in the peasant class largely, and they were critical about the social exploitation, right? So that was the moment of realism. Now we will look at Impressionism. Impressionism comes after realism, but Impressionism dealt with the contemporary present, dealt with the gaze, dealt with the ocular reality, what we can say ocular reality, that which is seen by the eye, right? But whatever is seen by the eye is represented in a way that which is very different when it comes to the pictorial application or pictorial language, right? So it is in the 1830s photography was invented, right? So photography actually posed a question to the artist: if the reality is represented, or reality is being captured by the photograph or by the camera, what are artists going to do, right? So artists needed to reinvent the methods of painting. So it is the methods, techniques, and the manners of painting. Okay, so it is also the time of modernization. Not in terms of theoretical or philosophical thinking, but modernization in the actual material manifestation, right? So you see a number of modern technological innovations were happening at this point of time. Photography, as I mentioned, one, and you have iron casting was one thing that was that was emerging at this point of time, particularly the wrought iron metal casting revolutionized the architecture, right? And it was in the later half of 19th century, Paris became really the center of culture, right? It emerged slowly as the center of culture, and it is during the 60s and 70s you have Paris as a city being redesigned altogether, right? And because of the industrial revolution, the population got increased in the major cities, in the urban centers, and Paris is one of the urban center, right? So the expansion of population happened, right? And because of the expansion of population and because of the industrial labor and industrial work, and we know that industrial work happens at a particular time, right? There is a time, working time, right? So the working time and the leisure time got differentiated, right? It is during this time in the 19th century where the working time and the leisure time gets differentiated. In the peasant context, in the pre-modern context, we did not have this kind of a differentiation. So when the workers have finished their work, they needed some refreshment, they needed some kind of an entertainment. So which is why you have the operas coming at this point of time, you have ballets, you have theatre, you have circus, you have different other amusement activities emerged at this point of time. And you know, museum is something that also becomes very important. Museum establishments and circus, zoo also is one thing that becomes more popular at this point of time. So what happens during the 19th century, throughout 19th century, but more forcefully with an acceleration in the later half of 19th century, right? So these amusement activities in the city become more interesting, right? And they lend a particular culture, a particular urban culture, okay? And when it comes to the working time and the labor time, work time or the labor time and the leisure time. For the leisure time, all these activities were important, right? Entertainment activities were important. So the artists at this point of time were witnessing these developments. You know, the city was expanding, the city was changing. You have population increased in the cities, and the city got redesigned. So you have the cafes like Moulin Rouge and more important, you know, public spaces. So public sphere is something. Public sphere is the thing where people participate in thinking, people participate in the political activities, they express their opinions. That is what is public sphere, right, to put it very simply. So this is the situation, and in this situation the artists were working, and the challenge was to negotiate with these scientific developments and represent the society and the people in this particular socio-historical context, right? So apart from the photography, you have steam engine got invented, and which revolutionized the idea of speed. So for example, if you sit and see, or if you walk and look around, you can capture, your eye can see more clearly, right? For example, if you are in a car and then looking around, your eye cannot capture clearly about what is moving around, right? So the sense of vision, what the eye can see and what it can capture, got restructured because of the invention of steam engine, right? So speed enhanced the transportation, speed led to the travel of people, so it led to the movement of people, right? And electricity at a later point of time also adds another dimension to the scientific explorations, right? So these are few things that, and gas also is something that gets so where, you know, the gasoline lit lamps and the street lamps are lit with gasoline. So you have an entire plan of the city is reorganized with the new scientific infrastructure, right? So this is the basic sort of a ground on which we can start thinking about Impressionism, and artists were working with this. And when it comes to vision, looking and representing that into painting, the color theory at this point of time is very important. It gets invented around mid 19th century, and artists started using the ideas of color theory, right? So we'll look at these things as we go ahead. Now, Impressionism was a 19th century art movement that began as a loose association of Paris-based artists. So basically Paris-based artists. You have a particular language of painting emerging at this point of time, who began exhibiting their art publicly in the 1960s, right? It is in the 60s it became public, but artists were working in this particular mode in their studios. There are schools like Barbizon School, you can look it up online if you want, Barbizon School. It was a school set in a sort of a remote forest village called Fontainebleau, where artists came together and just worked, just painted landscapes. So that is one of the inspiration for the Impressionists. Turner was another inspiration for Impressionists. So the name of the movement is derived from one of the paintings by an artist called Claude Monet. Monet painted a painting and titled it as Impression Sunrise, right? So from where you have Impressionism as a term coming. So a critic called Louis Leroy, who was writing for 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, he actually sort of sarcastically said, what is it? Is it impressionistic or impression? Or so from his sarcastic commentary, the artists have actually taken that name, that term called impression, and Impressionism was the name that they adopted for their group. So they exhibited for the first time as a group in 1874, and that was when Louis Leroy comes and he reviews that exhibition, and in that review he mentions about the impression. So from where you have Impressionism as a term coming to use, right? So the chemical photography, as I said, was invented in 1826, and gradually it sort of evolved. Its techniques got evolved, and Impressionist artists felt, as I said, photography was running the art of painting, right? That may be landscape, that may be portraiture, you know. So they faced this challenge. So the public at first hated the paintings of these Impressionist paintings, and gradually they tried to they started appreciating, you know, because of the change of the environment maybe. So the critics also continued to disapprove initially, but later they sort of agreed. They said it appeared as if you know, the paintings are unfinished, you know, because they looked sketchy. Because we'll look at paintings and we'll see why it looked unfinished. Now you can remember that till then you have paintings largely done in the neoclassical language, right, where you don't see any brush stroke, the presence of any brush stroke. The brush strokes were invisible, but Impressionists used the visible brush strokes, the dabs of color, without mixing on the palette. So the mixture actually happens on the canvas, right? So Impressionists changed the approach to painting. They entirely changed it, and they painted outdoors, you know. They changed it by creating the sensation of the eye that views the subject rather than recreating the subject. This is very important. They painted what the eye has seen and the sensation of the eye rather than to recreate a subject that we already know, right? So the eye becomes very important here, and what the eye captures, right? So when it comes to brush strokes, you know, the visible brush strokes, artists have broken the solid shape into smaller pieces, into smaller and blurred edges of the brush strokes, you know. So they use dabs of color without painting a flat whatever surface. They used small dabs of color and build the body of the pigment of the object or whatever they have represented. So another point is the emphasis on light. Light is a very important point when it comes to Impressionism. Okay, they captured the light actually. When you look at Impressionist paintings, what you see is the way the light is falling on the surface, on the objects in the landscape, right? So they tried to capture that light, and remember, light is temporal, right? The light that you see in the morning is different in the afternoon and in the evening, and light is associated with shadow, right? So Impressionists were trying to capture this fleeting moment of light. These are two important points. The fleeting moment of light. It is momentary, it is transient. So which is why they are not grand looking, they like, let us say, neoclassical paintings, right? So people were accustomed to see neoclassical paintings. Suddenly when they saw this, where they look sketchy, they look transient and fleeting, what they saw was the patches of color. So they initially disapproved, right? So color in artwork is illuminated or seems to glow. So there is a sense of light coming from in, there is a sense of the light, and Impressionist paintings actually have washed away the dark areas of European painting. This is one of the critics who said that, Impressionist paintings have washed away the dark areas of European painting. So that you can see when you look at the paintings. Okay. Unusual visual angles. Visual angles were also very unusual, very unorthodox, very common, very mundane. They are not very planned and composed and orderly kind of compositions, right? And outdoor painting. All of the Impressionists spent time painting outdoor, right? Unlike the earlier practice where even when the landscape is painted, the artists were painting inside the studio, right? It is with the Impressionists who started going outdoors, sitting in the landscape and painting, keeping the easel and then painting right there. So they had to finish with an amount of time, with a limited amount of time. So the speed of painting was matching with the speed of light, in the sense the transience of light, right? And another thing is the weather. They try to capture the atmospheric effect, the weather, the time, whether the mood, whether it is winter or summer or morning, or so the time, so both the time of the day or the time of the year, the season. So you can see Impressionism has actually moved away from the earlier ways of painting, earlier techniques of painting, as well as earlier subject matters, right? So what they were painting was what they were seeing, and this is the principle of modern painting. Like Charles Baudelaire said, a modern painter would paint what he sees with his own eye, not what is imagined, not what is believed, right? So this movement after realism is the first modern movement in painting. Realists also have painted with that modern spirit, with that modern framework of painting, but what departs Impressionism is the language. The language itself, the way, the method of painting itself makes it very new, very modern, right? So you can see short, thick strokes of paint are used to quickly capture the essence of subject rather than its details, so you don't see much of details, right? So that was also a disappointment for the viewers and the critics, right? So colors, as I said, were not mixed on the palette, right? They were not pre-mixed, but the primary colors, the fresh colors, were applied one after another. They were juxtaposed together, right, creating a vibrant surface. So what happens is those color patches mix inside your eye. So it is the physiognomic operation of the eye. So which is why eye is very important for them, right? The optical mixing of colors occur in the eye of the viewer, right? When you look closely, when you go close and look at the Impressionist paintings, what you see is the patches of different colors, right? But you need that distance, and the distance is already implied or expected from the viewer, right? So from a distance, you are in the eye, those patches would mix together and form a form, like whether it is a tree or a house or a human figure or whatever, right? So this is very important when it comes to Impressionism, right? So the color theory of Eugene Chevreul. Eugene Chevreul was a color theorist and scientist who experimented with color theory, and the idea of color theory and the number of colors, primary colors, secondary colors, color wheel, and the color psychology, and all these aspects of color was proposed at this point of time. And the Impressionists were actually studying, were actually knowing and getting influenced from these color theories, right? So this is another important point when it comes to Impressionism. So these things never happened before, right? So scientific innovations are very close to, closely linked to the Impressionist development in painting, right. So, the play of natural light is emphasized. It is the natural light rather than the dramatic light that we see in the neoclassical times, or even in realism we have a sense of artificial focused light, but Impressionists maintained to use natural light and the effects of natural light, right. Close attention is paid to the reflection of colors from objects to object, right. So, the reflection between two colors, like for example a red object is there and you have some other color, how this red, the color the reflection of the red object affects the color of the other object, you know. So, which is not very clearly visible for a naked eye, which needs a certain amount of training, right, which artists didn't bother earlier, but now artists are trying to work in the context of Impressionism. So, quickly let us move to the artists. We have a group of artists. There were several artists who worked in the Impressionist style, but there were few we can look at. Claude Monet, as you can see here on the screen, Claude Monet, who was more interested in the outdoors, who painted gardens, largely the outdoor landscapes, and also he, at a later point of time, he owned a sort of a house where he had his ponds and he painted lily ponds extensively. Edouard Manet was one of the early artists who was part of realism, who worked in the realist language. Later he evolved into Impressionist language. So, he is known for his social critique. He responded critically to the society and what was happening in society, and particularly the hypocrisy of the ruling class and the bourgeois class. Another artist is Renoir. Renoir painted people. Renoir worked in a ceramic factory. He used to paint porcelain, paint on the porcelain objects. So, and from there he shifts into painting. So, that experience can be seen in his painting and in his color effect particularly. And he painted people in the outdoors and, you know, people having fun and enjoying. And Edgar Degas is an artist who is very significant and very different from other artists who painted dancers, theatre and activities of this sort. He was also known as keyhole painter. Just remember, Degas was known as, was called as you know, as a sort of a joke, as, you know, keyhole painter. Another artist is Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was older to other artists of the group. He was like a father figure, and he painted cities, streets, and he used to travel outside Paris to the villages nearby and suburbs, and he painted as he traveled. And Paul Cézanne is one of the accompanying artists and friend of Pissarro. And Alfred Sisley, who painted rivers and landscapes. Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt, apart from 𝗵𝗫 Morisset, whom we are not seeing today, Mary Cassatt was the second female artist, one can say, in the context of Impressionist group. Right? She painted the domestic ambiences, the not outdoors but the indoors and the activities of the indoors. Claude Monet. Now, Claude Monet, if you look at Claude Monet, he was the first to paint in this particular language of Impressionism, but he was not the first, sorry, he was not the first, but he was the first to be accepted, you know, as an Impressionist painter, right. His main subjects were nature and landscapes, right, and the plain air on the outside. Painted same scenes every day, scenes day after day to capture. He is the one artist who painted one particular scene several times, both in day, both in the day, like in the morning, afternoon and evening, as well as in the season. So, he studied this temporality and the changes of time and changing light. Weather, atmosphere and changing of seasons is also preoccupied Monet, right. So, Monet's early paintings had people, had figures, but he later moved to only painting scenes, only painting let us say streets or landscapes or architecture sometimes, but not people. And later he moves into this painting water lilies and no figures, right. So, the slide that you see now called Monet, the Impression Sunrise, right. Impression Sunrise was exhibited in 1874 in the first Impressionist exhibition, and this is the painting which led to the naming of Impressionism, a naming of the group as Impressionism or the movement Impressionism. What you see in this is, as I said, when you go close, and what you see in this is just sketchy application of pigment, right, sketchy application of color on the canvas. You don't see anything clear, right. So, you can see the brush marks, you look at the boat in the center in the foreground, where the boat is nothing but just a patch of color, and the two figures are just two dots or just dabs of color, right, and all the reflection of the sun and the sky, everything appears as if merging into each other, and it is very sketchy and not clear, right. And this actually shocked the people. This actually sort of created a sort of a critique and scandal for people as well as critics. So, people could not digest this initially, right. So, if you go close and see, what you see is just the dabs of color. If you come back and look at it, then you can see, yeah, there is a boat is in the sea, and maybe a river if not sea, and you have it may be early in the morning or in the evening where the sun is slanted, like it is not on the top but on the side, which is either evening or morning, and you have a fog around. So, you can actually see and decipher what is happening, and this is the character of Impressionist language, where you can experience, you can actually get the mood, you know, you can get the sense of mood and the weather, the timing and the light. So, it is more about this rather than the clear representation, right. So, move to the next slide now, where, as I said, this is painted slightly earlier than the impression, where you have a sort of a clarity, right, and you also see here is the clear sky, very dramatic though, but clear sky, and you see the landscape, right. It is called poppies, where you have this bourgeois lady with her parasol and her daughter. She is walking towards you, right, and you can, as if almost like welcoming you to enter into this landscape, and what you see is this expanse of landscape, right. So, Monet used to paint like this, where you don't have anything gloomy, you don't have anything sad, you have this bright landscape washed with sunlight, right. So, Impressionism, and we can see this in the other artists also, Impressionism appears like a celebration of modernism, right. It is celebrating the modern, right. It is not criticizing, it is not, it is about the moment of celebration, and most of the Impressionist artists, almost all the Impressionist artists came from a sort of a middle class, established bourgeois class, either bourgeois class or the middle class. They were not coming from, let us say, the peasant class or the lower classes. For example, realist artists were coming from the lower classes and the peasant classes, right. But most of the Impressionist, almost all the Impressionist artists were more or less coming from the urban locations as well as from the well-versed families, classes. So, what you see in their expressions through Impressionism is the celebration of modernism, the scientific developments or whatever, you can see that celebration, and that also like public gatherings and, you know, parties, and we will see that parties a lot apart from the public spaces, right. Public space is also an important thing when it comes to Impressionism. So, next slide is again Monet, and this is an example of what was happening in terms of the transportation, scientific development. So, this is not a landscape, but this is a sort of a streetscape, a sort of a urban location where you have, it is a train station, right, Saint Lazare train station, and this is very interesting, where what you see here is a sort of a fog, a sort of a smoke smoke is coming out of the steam engine, and everything is painted with a sort of a sketchy, rough treatment, and you don't see anything clearly, but you can get the effect of what is shown, right. And what happens here is the color, the pigment, you can see the pigment very clearly, right. You can see the application of pigment, the marks of pigment, right. But you can understand that the pigment is converting itself into or translating into the form. For example, the blue-white pigment that you see on the top, which is nothing but fog, or sorry, which is nothing but smoke, right. But if you forget the fact that it is smoke, it is nothing but the white, bluish white pigment, it is oil paint, right. You can see oil paint in Impressionist paintings, but at the same time the oil paint also translates simultaneously into the form. That may be train, that may be steam engine, that may be smoke, or the architecture. And what you see in architecture here is the wrought iron architecture, which I said is it created a revolution in the designing, architectural designing. Again, when you look at Monet and the point that I was mentioning about the capturing of different times, right. So, you have two images in this where the same scene, grain stacks in the sunlight, grain stacks, end of the day, autumn, right. So, what is he doing? What is Monet doing here is he is painting the same scene in two different times, and how the effect of light can be created, or maybe studying the effect of light, right, to capture that effect of light. And the effect of light is nothing but the effect of the mood, right. You see in the first image it is the morning and the fresh light, the light is washing the entire scene, and it creates a sense of happiness, a sense of celebration. And in the evening, like the end of day, the second one, if you look at, where it doesn't have that sense of bliss, right. It is giving a gloomy effect, or maybe this is end of the day and the effect of light is also dull, right. So, Monet painted number of such paintings, haystacks, Notre Dame, he painted the cathedral, he painted several other scenes within Paris. Okay. So, Monet is known for this serial painting. And let us move to the next artist, Renoir, Auguste Renoir. Renoir painted with bright, vibrant light, and one important point about Renoir is the saturation of the color. He painted with saturated color, most often focused on people, and he needed people. He painted people in intimate and candid compositions, right. His rendering of figures is not very rough, but well, it falls in the Impressionist mode anyway. So, females were his primary subject. He painted female nudes, he painted females separately, and he was influenced by, for example, Rubens nudes. Rubens also painted very supple nudes. So, his nudes were influenced by Rubens. He also tried to paint very voluptuous and supple nudes, and you can look at them online if you want more. So, later in life he went back to more traditional style of painting. So, he moved towards more traditional style of painting than what he used to do earlier. So, he was a painter of people. Like Monet, he was interested in light and how it defined the passing movement, but he rarely painted without images of people, right. So, people having pleasure, people enjoying. It is important to know that these are always modern people, right. It, like Monet, or you can see in the other artists also, it doesn't show about the people of other time, or like in the context of neoclassicism they talked about the Greece, the Greeks or Romans. But here in the modern context, the people are modern people, their activities, their pleasures. So, they are his contemporaries, primarily middle class Parisians, right, enjoying their leisure time in outdoor and cultural events. So, Renoir is more focused on capturing the pleasure and leisure of Parisian middle class, partying outdoors, meetings and partying in the boats, and so outings, so pleasure basically. So in characteristic Impressionist style, Renoir suggested the details of his scene through freely brushed strokes of color, right. So he used brush strokes very freely, and there is a sense of softness when you look at his paintings. So all these small brush strokes come together and they create a sensation of softness, and the figures fuse very naturally with the surroundings, So if you look at this painting, Renoir, the luncheon of the boating party, so it is about the celebration, right? It is about the celebration where one friend is engaged, and it is about the celebration of that engagement. But what you see in Renoir's painting, and also in other artists like Degas and Manet, what you see here is when you look at people, their gaze are tied up with the other person, but the other person is not quite looking at them. If you look at the three figures on the right side, where the lady is looking at that man who is sitting there, and he is not actually reciprocating the gaze, but he is looking at somewhere else, right? And the man who is standing over them, slightly bent towards them, is looking at this lady, but she is not interested in him. So Impressionists captured the social relations of this particular class, the social relations of the middle class and the bourgeois class, where these social relations are really isolated, in the sense the people appear as if they are isolated, and we can see more works, and we can see this, and you can also look at more paintings where the gaze, the concept of gaze is something that emerges at this point of time. Gaze is something where if I am looking at someone and that person whom I am looking at doesn't quite know that I am looking at him, right. So gaze has this play of power. I am looking at that person, that may be male or female, and that person doesn't know, but I am actually taking pleasure of looking at that person, right. So it is my power to be able to see and not to be noticed, right. So you have this play of gaze, and which is again part of voyeurism. Voyeurism is the pleasure of looking. Voyeurism is something that emerges in the mid-19th century, and voyeurism, or voyeuristic pleasure, voyeurism is a French term. Okay, a voyeur is someone who takes pleasure in looking at others, in seeing, and taking pleasure in seeing. So we can see this playing very intimately in the Impressionist paintings. This gets reflected. And another term is flâneur. Flâneur is someone who just walks in the city, who strolls in the city, right, aimlessly, who doesn't have any work. There's no aim. He's not going to anywhere. He's not going to work, or he's not going to a theater, but he just walks in the city. That is flâneur. And the mid-19th century Paris and the 19th century Paris, after mid-19th century, you can see that led to the emergence of flâneur and the voyeur. You can see for the sake of pleasure, and you can walk for the sake of pleasure. And you can see here voyeurism playing a role in this painting, right. Let us move to the next. And in this painting, the theatre box, voyeurism is more evident, right. And it is at this point of time the binoculars were more popular, and you can see in this particular painting where a woman is sitting and woman is looking at you, but not gazing at you. Woman is looking out, but if you look at her eyes, she is not actually having a dialogue with you. She is not actually looking at you. She is seeing but not looking. Her attention is not towards something specified. Her gaze is lost, her look is lost, she's actually lost in herself. So this is what a sort of a desolation, a sort of an isolation, right, that modernism created. So you look at the man at the back who could be the husband of this lady, right. So the husband is not at all paying attention to this lady who may be suffering, who may be psychologically suffering, or who may be feeling, who may be sad, but the man is not interested in her sadness or happiness. The man looks at somewhere entirely away, and he is visually consuming, visually taking pleasure, looking through his binoculars, someone maybe across the theatre, right. So on the other side maybe, right. So what is happening here is the consumption is happening through gaze, through looking, right. So and the individuals are isolated. Even then when they are together, they're emotionally, psychologically, they are lost or they are somewhere else, right. So this is very important to understand when you look at this particular time. And Impressionism these artists have captured these subtle human conditions, right. So the next artist is Alfred Sisley. Sisley mostly painted the landscapes. He never painted figures. He painted figures for a while, but he got back to landscapes. So a series of paintings, the important series of paintings is a set of paintings that he did of river themes, river themes. So river with bridge and all. So mostly around Hampton Court. So he painted the river and the bridges around the Hampton Court, executed in 1874. So that was the time when the exhibition took place. So he was the most consistent of Impressionists in his dedication to painting landscape, that is outdoors. He always painted outdoors and particularly landscapes. And look at his painting now. This particular painting, the bridge, it is nothing but you have a river and you have a bridge at the left, and it takes you in, right. It has a sort of a dramatized perspective, the way he is composing, and it takes you in, and what you see is something very simple, nothing grand, nothing very important, but something very simple. You have few houses, and what you have is this very clear sky, serene sky, and the entire scene is lit up with this fresh, bright, crisp sunlight, right, and warm sunlight. So he actually captured this mood, this freshness, and the light. And look at the way he has painted the water. What you see over there is just the patches of green and blue, and so, but from a distance those patches are forming and becoming water in our eyes. So this is the logic of Impressionism. It's a very good example to understand that. Another painting, again the same kind of a logic. He had a consistency when it comes to composition. This is the kind of composition where you have a sort of a dramatized perspective, it goes in and you have a vanishing point, but vanishing point is not holding something very significant, it is very simple, right. What you have, you come back because there is nothing significant, you come back to the foreground. So there is a kind of a movement, circular movement that happens within a very pleasurable circular movement of the eye happens within the painting, right. So another artist that we'll move now to is Edgar Degas. Degas, as I said, is called as a keyhole painter because if you look from a keyhole, the other person, the person of the other side, I mean through the keyhole, if you are looking, the other person do not know that you are looking, right. So he used to kind of compose his paintings in such a way that his location is very obscure, right. So why we can say that? Because he had cropped subjects awkwardly. His compositions are very different, very radical, very unconventional, showed emotional tension, right. chose unusual viewpoints, which is why he's called a keyhole painter, linked to his fascination with photography, right. So he was very fascinated with photography and experimented compositionally, particularly with photographic techniques, at least practice. He captured snapshots. So in that sense, it is not that he's composing in the sense of a balance, in the sense of a certain kind of a principles of composition, but he's also creating a sense of snapshot compositions. You can see that when you look at the paintings. And he painted extensively ballerinas. He's known for painting ballerinas because also maybe they sold well, right. So though he captured the elegance of the dance, the figures were often in awkward poses. So the figures were engaged in not comfortable poses. Let's say a girl is pulling her slacks up, or putting her dress, or in these awkward poses, very informal awkward poses, and are often cropped from the composition in unusual ways, right. So this particular aspect of unusual ways of composition is the innovative contribution of Degas, right. Instead of looking posed, he gives the scenes an element of randomness, a sort of a spontaneity, as if it just happened, right. Not that he has planned, but the planning is in such a way that it gives the feeling of spontaneity, right. Like the other Impressionists, he is interested in light and changing atmosphere, of course, but his is almost always the light of the stage or indoor, right. So his is the artificial light. Unlike the other painters, and you have seen 𝗹𝗶𝗇 and who captures beautifully the natural light, Degas captures the artificial light. He was interested in the artificial light of the stage and how that light dramatizes the expressions of the faces of the actors. So he was interested in that. And if you look at this painting in this slide on your monitor, the dance class, right. So you can see here all the figures are pulled to one side, right, and the bottom right and the half of the stage is empty, right. So this is what we were talking about, the sense of snapshotness, or the compositions look random or spontaneous or cut awkwardly. There is this sense of awkwardness. It doesn't fit into the ideals of composition, right. So the earlier artists would calculate and balance everything and compose, but here he is deliberately composing in such a way that it looks awkward, it looks disbalanced. So the emptiness that he is leaving on the one side, and he is composing the ballerinas engaged in dance on the other side, on the left side, right. And you can see the light entering through the windows and filtered through the windows, and you can see here the back of the trainer on the left side. You can see the dark shape that you have, the back of the trainer, the male trainer, right. And the back, showing the back in the painting is very, very unusual, right. You don't generally get to see the back where the figure is not turning his head towards the viewer. Here the figure is not turning the head towards the viewer, right. The figure is not engaging with the viewer, right. So this particular kind of a composition again is influenced or inspired by the from the Japanese woodcut prints, and we can have look at one or two examples I'll show you, where the compositions of Japanese woodcut prints really influences the Impressionist compositions, right. So the other painting, move to other painting, the same thing, the dance class, where you have the male trainer right in the center. Again you have this empty space on the right bottom, and he's composing around, and you can see they are posed and poised, and this is not the moment of actually dance, but this is the moment in between the dance instruction, right. He's where the figures are kind of trying on themselves. It is not a sort of a synchronized dance. So these are the informal movements that he is using. And if you want further analysis about this painting, you can look at Griselda Pollock, who analyzed it from a feminist framework, from a feminist position, where the masculine, the man trainer standing very erect, stand straight, and he's the only male figure in this, and you have these all teenaged adolescent girls. So let us not get into that analysis, but if you are interested, you can look at her writing. And another painting is very interesting of Degas, which is this is again a bar where you have two figures pushed to the corner right top, and again the unusual random sort of a composition cut very randomly, and you have this bench, right, the bench that is taking your eye in, right. If you move, you can move like that, and two benches are arranged, and in the corner you have one lady and a man sitting. The lady is very gloomy, she is not happy, she is lost in herself, her eyes are open, but she is maybe thinking something else, or she is worried about something else, and we never know if she is a prostitute or the wife of that man. It does not appear as if she is the wife of that man, because there is a distance between both of them when they are sitting. And the man is entirely, it is very much like Renoir. The man is not interested in her. The attention of the man is entirely outside. He is looking at someone entirely outside. So this again captures that moment. And prostitution was very much in practice at that point of time. Let us quickly move to Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was a revolutionary figure, and Renoir referred to him as a revolutionary figure through his artistic portrayals of the common man, right? As Pissarro insisted on painting individuals in natural settings without artifice or grandeur. So he is the one who was very influential to many of the young Impressionists. And let us move to his painting. This particular painting that you see, it's nothing but a simple painting. There's nothing grandeur about it. It is the chestnut trees at Arsney, and as I said, he used to travel and paint. And what you see here is a sort of a stable composition, right? Unlike the other Impressionists, you see Pissarro maintains a sort of a stable composition. You have the trees on either side, right? The four trees distributed on either side, very balanced sort of a composition, and the balance is sort of altered by the figure on the right side, you know, the figure collecting maybe the nuts of the chestnut tree, and you have this landscape at the back where again you have two lines. You can actually draw two lines horizontally, and between two horizontal lines you have a sort of a diagonal line of the plane, right? It's a very calculated kind of a composition, which is very different in temperament from the other Impressionist painters. Again, you can have the sense of the environment, sense of the weather, and the freshness of the light of the outside. And outside, the non-urban or the village and nature was something very important for these artists, because you know nature was not easily available for Parisians, right? So going out and picnic was a kind of a thing that was necessary for them to take a break from the urban life, right? So nature became exotic by then. And the other artist that we see is Edward Manet, right? Edward Manet was, he started as a realist painter and then moves to Impressionism. So he painted themes that would disturb the viewers, right? So this example that you see, Luncheon on the Grass, it is about the lifestyle of the bourgeois men. What you see is this figure sitting right in the center and looking at you, right? Looking at the viewer, looking at outside, and she is not wearing anything, she is nude, but the other men were wearing, right. So, they are conversing in themselves, and there is another figure right at the back in the background where she is coming out from the pond, right. And in the foreground you have this food, fruits and other food, right. So, here the kind of treatment of the nude figure, the female figure, and the way the flesh of the nude figure is emanating a sense of light. So, and her gaze is very questioning, she is encountering your gaze, she is not inviting, her gaze is asking, making you conscious when you are looking at it, it is making you conscious that you are looking at me, right. So, this is a painting which sort of is a critique of the hypocrisy of the bourgeois middle class society, right. How the women were objectified, how the prostitutes were objectified, and how they were consumed almost like the food, right. And this is set in this forest sort of a setting in the nature, and how she is naked and both the men are dressed up, right. They are dressed up in the bourgeois costume, they are coming, it is a class reflection also, right. So, we have seen Impressionism, we have seen these artists, and the last painting that you see here is Olympia. It is the same logic, Olympia, the female figure, it is almost like Venus, Titian's Venus, reclining on the bed. But here, unlike the Venus of Titian, who is very coyish, who is inviting, this Venus, this Olympia is questioning. Olympia is looking directly into the viewer, right, where it is creating a question of what are you looking at, or it is making aware of the gaze of the person, right. So, this is again the questioning, and how the body of the prostitutes are objectified by this bourgeois society, right. So, we have looked at some of the Impressionist artists, and one last artist we need to look at before finishing is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was American born, and she was a friend of Edgar Degas, and she comes to Paris and she stays and works in Paris, right. She mastered oil painting, and unlike the other male Impressionists, she stayed indoors and painted indoors whatever she observed, right. So, she painted her children, her domestic activities. So, this painting for example, Mother and Child, as you can see, the brush application is very much impressionistic, but you can see the love, affection of the domestic ambience, the mother and the child, right. And she was very much influenced by the Japanese woodcut prints, and she also started painting, she also started printing, and this is one of the examples of her influence coming from the Japanese woodcut prints, and the entire language of the print changed, and so we have seen Impressionism and how Impressionism was showing the social reality, the human relations, the social relations, and the conditions of the mid-19th century or late 19th century France particularly. Thank you.